So there was a major development this week when a man was arrested in Liverpool in connection with the murder of Robbie Lawlor. What do we know, Ken, so far about this individual?
Well, Niall, it's considered a very significant development in relation to this, probably one of the most high-profile gangland murders that we've had for decades in our country. He's a 32-year-old man. He's linked with an organised crime gang. He was arrested in Liverpool area earlier this week, and he was transported to Northern Ireland by plane. He remains in custody at the moment. He can be held for up to 36 hours before the PSNI need to approach court to perhaps request additional time to question him.
Yeah. So, I mean, it is a major development in the murder of Robbie Lawlor. I mean, I think it's fair to say one of the most complex and complicated gangland hits in Irish history. The reason it is so complex is because so many of the most infamous names have been mentioned in connection with it, and then a lot of other hangers-on. But just to even keep it at a simple level, some of the names that are alleged or suspected of being linked to it are Mr. Big, the North Dublin drugs trafficker, who's one of the major players in the drugs trade in Ireland. Cornelius Price, who has since died, but was a leading member of one of the two feuding gangs in Drogheda, and also Barry Young, although not faced any charges, has been linked in connection with it. Barry Young is currently serving 11 years for directing a crime gang, and that's just some of them, Ken. So how did Robbie Lawlor, in his, I think he was around 40 years old, how did he manage? Who was he, and how did he manage to fall out with? And that's just some of the names. There's also the McCarthy Dundons and various others. But how did Robbie Lawlor? Who is he, and how did he manage to annoy so many people, to say the least?
Well, Niall, just to agree with you there, I don't think, and we've done a few of these shows, I don't think we're ever going to talk about more complicated or complex situation than this particular murder. So if we just distill it back to who Robbie Lawlor was, at the time he was murdered, he was a 36-year-old father of three. He's originally from Donamead, but he built up a reputation essentially as a gangland serial killer, which kind of started back in 2009. He was linked to a murder of a man. It was 2005. Murder of a Tallaght criminal outside Mountjoy Prison. An attempted murder of an individual who was shot while he held his baby boy in his arms in Darndale back in 2008. Chief suspect for the murder of a rival criminal called David Fred Lynch in March 2009. He was less than a year later, again, the chief suspect for the murder of an individual called Noel Deans, a 27-year-old at the time, who wasn't really that much of a serious criminal, but kind of what made Lawlor kind of a bit notorious in criminal circles was that he ended up having a cup of tea with Mr. Dean's mother in the aftermath of that killing. He was also involved in a feud with a notorious gangster called John Paul Joyce, and who was shot dead in 2008. He was also probably what brings us to where we're going is in February 2018, Gardaí believe he's the man that shot dead a criminal called Kenneth Finn, again in Darndale. And it's kind of from that background. He'd spent a lot of time in jail. He was known as kind of a very ruthless person, someone that really held grudges. He was kind of psychopathic, some people would describe him as. So there's many, and he was connected basically to every serious organised crime gang in Ireland. So what leads us to Belfast and his murder, actually during the height of the COVID pandemic, it was actually, is a very tangled web.
Yeah, I mean, like Robbie Lawlor would have grown up in roughly the same area as Mr. Big. He would have known a lot of those same people. But as you said, just because you knew Robbie Lawlor, knowing him probably means he was a good chance of falling out with him at some stage. And certainly the murder of Kenneth Finn, who was very close to Mr. Big. He was one of his trusted associates. Ken Finn and Robbie Lawlor would have, I think, at some stage been sort of palling around in the same group, but Robbie Lawlor had him shot. And then also, as well as falling out with Mr. Big, obviously Robbie Lawlor became very closely associated, very heavily involved in the Drogheda feud, which would have brought him in direct conflict with Cornelius Price and Owen Maguire. And obviously, at the time of his death, Robbie Lawlor was very much the focus of the Garda investigation into one of probably, arguably, the most shocking gangland crime of this century, which was the murder of Keane Mulready Woods.
Yes, Niall, but I suppose we again, because of the complex nature of this situation, we probably need to rewind and back. If we're looking at the Drogheda feud and what inflamed it, essentially that was one gang that ended up having a falling out. There was Dublin criminals on one side that kind of we legally call them the anti-Maguire faction, but in this row, Lawlor was enlisted to murder Owen Maguire, who was essentially the leader of that gang. And the shooting happened in July 2018, and it has left Maguire paralysed. Maguire is still an active criminal despite being paralysed, but he did that on behalf of basically Dublin associates who wanted to muscle in what's a very, very lucrative drugs trade in County Louth and County Meath. And Lawlor was enlisted for this hit. He actually, as we know, Maguire didn't die, but that inflamed the Drogheda feud, which after that, it just, as you know, we both covered it together many times. There was hundreds and hundreds of incidents of damage to property, assaults, shootings, and actually 4 murders directly linked to it.
Yeah, and of course, at the centre of all this, Robbie Lawlor was, certainly for that faction, he was the most feared figure. If an unusual person by all accounts, Robbie Lawlor, in that he was, a fitness fanatic as well, and he was even posting about doing charity work for charities in the Middle East in the middle of it. So just an unusual sort of personality, but by all accounts, very, very hyped up, and could change at the flick of a switch. Obviously, then what happened was, when it was April 2020, I remember working it was a Saturday at the time, and we started.
I remember it well myself now.
Yeah, it was
chaotic for a while, wasn't it?
It was very chaotic and very confusing, because we started hearing from people on the ground that Robbie Lawlor had been shot in West Belfast. Not a place you'd expect him to be, but it looked like it was a well-planned operation.
It was, and there is 2 gentlemen before the court in the north in relation to, neither of them are suspected gunmen in relation to what happened. But you mentioned earlier about the Keane Mulready Woods murder, which a grotesque event, which he is the chief suspect for. So Lawlor had been on remand in prison in relation to threats to kill and various other firearms offences, which he was actually cleared by a jury of. Again, Niall, we would have covered that. It wasn't long before Christmas of December 2019. And Lawlor was basically only out of jail 2 weeks, or maybe, about 3 weeks, when he actually murdered Keane Mulready Woods, stabbed him to death, and then we know about the horrific dismemberment of that 17-year-old's body and everything like that. So to bring it up to April 2020, Lawlor was essentially, the guards had identified him as the chief suspect in that murder. It made international headlines, of course it did. And he had spent some time in Turkey and Spain, but had arrived back in the country before the pandemic began. And what he was doing, he was going around collecting debts on behalf of his brother-in-law, who had been Richie Carberry, who had been murdered in November 2019 as part of the same feud. So he's essentially traveling around. There was information he had issued the vilest threats possible against a female in Athlone as part of this drive. So he ended up in Belfast. It seems what seems to have happened now is that members of the McCarthy Dundon gang, infamous Limerick gang, basically had lured him to Belfast to collect debts on their behalf, and that's why he ended up in Belfast. He was on his debt collecting drive, and what happened then was he was essentially set up and shot multiple times in the head in what was a very planned murder.
Yeah, so I mean, this is where it all gets confusing, because I suppose there's all of these criminal factions who are suspected of having a role, and one of those criminal factions would be a gang led by Barry Young. Barry Young was from Sligo. He would have become one of the biggest players in the drugs trade, not just in that part of the northwest, but also within Northern Ireland. So Barry Young we would have always known and always associated him with Mr. Big, who would have been regarded as being one of his suppliers or one step up the ladder from him. And Barry Young was, suspected of. We heard in some previous court hearings that that a man met in a hotel in Sligo with Barry Young, and that has all been said in court. So Barry Young is I think suspected of helping organise some of the logistics of this murder. So who is Barry Young, Ken? I mean, he's currently behind bars, but he was one of the more significant sort of, I suppose, rural drug dealers, but also on an international scale as well.
Yes, well, before the guards arrested Barry Young was kind of one of the main drug traffickers supplying the western seaboard of our country, and as you rightly say, into Northern Ireland as well. But the problem for Barry Young, he's obviously serving a significant sentence, and there is more of his associates are going to be sentenced before the courts in the coming months in Galway and Sligo. But in relation to the guards, massive clampdown on his gang. But what happened with Barry Young is, as you again rightly say, the drugs trafficker we described as Mr. Big. Young was sourcing his drugs off this North Dublin criminal, arch criminal, if you like, and Young fell into debt with him. So again, with the complicated nature of this actual murder, what's believed is that it all goes back to Mr. Big's close associate, Kenneth Finn, being murdered. That's why he, who we call Mr. Big, decided that Lawlor had to be taken out. It was the ultimate affront to him. So Young had owed a significant amount of money to Mr. Big, and basically some say that Young, despite his criminal pedigree, was only a lackey to this much more senior person. And it's what seems to have happened is that this hit was ordered from the individual for legal reasons that we call Mr. Big, and that Young was almost forced into involvement in it. Now, there is a belief among certain Gardaí that Young, once he finishes his sentence, which is a long one, for directing an organised crime gang, will actually face possible extradition hearings to the north for his involvement in it. But what we do know is the individual that was arrested this week and is currently in custody is a close associate, almost kind of called a lieutenant.
Yeah, and into all that mix, of course, is Cornelius Price as well, who headed up this other gang. And we know that Cornelius Price, we spoke about the Dundon McCarthys being suspected of setting up Lawlor. And we know, of course, that Cornelius Price had a particularly close association with the Dundon McCarthys. For example, Ger Dundon, one of the Dundon brothers, one of the leaders of that Limerick gang, was arrested with Cornelius Price in the UK in relation to the abduction of a businessman over there. Cornelius Price passed away ultimately as a result of a brain condition, and Ger Dundon is currently serving a lengthy sentence behind bars. So all of these things, you know, all of these factors play in, but at the center of it all is I suppose, Mr. Big, as we call him. I suppose I'll ask you the same question again. Who is Mr. Big? And obviously we can't say his name, that's the way it is, but what do we know about him, and what sort of role does he have in sort of the whole gangland drugs trade in this country?
Well, Niall, there's a lot we can say that we can't say right now on this, but he's an individual aged in his mid-40s, North Dublin, involved in organised serious crime since his teenage years. I think there was you had a good old story from his young days back in East Wall, didn't you?
I did, yeah. I mean, look, he's from North Dublin, but he would have been fairly heavily involved in he would have grown up in the rave scene. He would have become heavily involved in drugs from a respectable enough background, and I suppose he really came to prominence, you know, with the
murders of the two real IRA brothers.
Exactly.
That's Alan and Vincent Ryan.
Exactly. I mean,
which kind of changed the landscape of gangland really in our country in many respects, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. And at that stage, Mr. Big was, you know, in his 30s or whatever. And the idea that somebody would have the nerve or the strength of organisation, I suppose, to kill Alan Ryan, who was the leader of the real IRA, it would have been outlandish if people had suggested it before he happened. But he took that decision, and he seems to have been in a position to believe that he could see off any fallout from that. And he was right. And as the Killian cartel have withdrawn, I suppose, from the day-to-day drugs business in terms of, you know, what happens on the streets, to certainly stay involved in it on a higher level, the Mr. Big organisation has probably become, I mean, one of the 2 or 3 most prominent organisations in this country.
There's absolutely no doubt about what you say there as well, and this is an individual that has links to where the product comes from, like Colombia and so on. So that's the level of what you're talking about. The guards continue to kind of try and tackle them in a sense. Like, one of his main associates has recently been charged with very serious crimes in relation to money laundering. So he himself would have built up a reputation as also, apart from drugs trafficking, being involved in tiger kidnappings, which at one stage were extremely lucrative. But despite all this, the man does not really have any serious criminal conviction.
So, I mean, it's, as you said, this man can be held for a number of hours, but it's undoubtedly a murder we're going to have to, the murder of Robbie Lawlor, it's going to be something we're going to be doing podcasts on again and again, Ken. So
complicated as it is, Niall, isn't it?
It's complicated, but it probably shows the reality of how gangs at that very top level operate. Like, we always like to sort of separate it and make it really clear there's this gang versus that gang, but certainly some of those EncroChat hacks in the North Show, when it comes to it, they work together, and those guys at the top will help each other out as long as there's something in it for them.
It's certainly not black and white, if you like. You know, it's a real mix. But I don't think in the history of we've been covering murders, Niall, since our early days in the Star.
Yeah,
I mean, did we ever come across anything as complicated as such a web as this one?
No, I don't think so. No,
it's very hard to even explain or to discuss, even almost.
It is, but we've done a decent job there, Ken, so we can take comfort in that. And no doubt we'll come back to it again.
Okay, my friend. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.